It happened at one of the country's most prestigious academic conferences, a gathering of America's brightest young minds where the intellectual elite debated and challenged ideas. In these hallowed halls, professors and scholars often showcase their superior knowledge by dismantling traditional values in the name of progressive thought. Among the attendees was Barron Trump, a young man who had earned his place through exceptional academic excellence. Yet, despite his accomplishments, whispers swirled that he was only there because of his family name. They did not know that by the end of the day, Barron would silence every doubt and stand resolute against one of the most outspoken intellectuals in the room. At the heart of the conference stood Professor Nathaniel Carter, a renowned academic celebrated for his razor-sharp wit and even sharper tongue. A self-proclaimed champion of rationality, Carter had built his career on deconstructing traditional beliefs, especially those of Christianity. To him, faith was an archaic relic to be mocked and discarded in favor of true intelligence. His lectures were not merely lessons. They were grand spectacles where faith was reduced to a punchline and God, the subject of ridicule. That morning, as students and scholars filled the grand lecture hall, an air of electric anticipation crackled. Everyone knew Professor Carter's reputation. His debates were legendary intellectual gladiator matches, and today promised to be no exception. What few expected, however, was that today's debate would take an unexpected turn. Carter took his place at the podium with his customary swagger. Adjusting his glasses and surveying the audience with a smirk, he began, "Let's address the elephant in the room." Folding his arms and letting his gaze wander across the room, he fixed his eyes briefly on Barron Trump. Studies consistently show an inverse correlation between intelligence and religious belief, he declared in a condescending tone. In simpler terms for those who might need it, the smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe in supernatural fantasies. His words were punctuated by a pause, during which the massive screen behind him lit up with a sharply declining graph. "See this?" Carter gestured dramatically. "This is what happens to religious belief as IQ and education levels rise." Fascinating, isn't it? A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, though many students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Among them, Professor Henry Wallace, a respected faculty member, watched with growing concern. He had seen Carter's provocative style before, but today, something felt different, more personal perhaps. Carter continued, "I suppose some of your family traditions might be an exception," he added with a pointed glance toward Barron. "It makes it harder for some to accept basic cognitive development." A few scattered laughs echoed, but overall, the hall fell into a heavy silence. Carter's tone was dripping with intellectual superiority as he pressed on. "You know what I find truly remarkable? We have some of the brightest minds gathered here today. Future scientists, leaders, and thinkers. Yet I guarantee some of you still cling to these primitive beliefs, unable to break free from your cognitive limitations." All eyes were now fixed on Barron Trump. Despite the barrage of mockery and insinuation, Barron remained perfectly still. His jaw tightened imperceptibly, yet his expression was calm and resolute. While many in the audience laughed nervously or looked down, Barron met Carter's gaze directly, unflinching. After a beat of silence that filled the hall like a held breath, Barron rose to his feet. The murmurs in the room grew louder as he stepped forward toward the podium. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, controlled, and measured. "I'd be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development," he said evenly. A flicker of amusement passed over Carter's face. Well, Carter retorted theatrically. "Young Mr. Trump wants to educate us about intellectual capacity. Please, do enlighten us. Tell us how your faith fits into the modern world of quantum physics and artificial intelligence." A few students snickered, anticipating Carter's expected ridicule. But Barron did not flinch. "First, I find it interesting that someone who prides himself on intellectual rigor would assume that belief in God automatically equates to a lack of intelligence," Barron replied steadily. "That isn't science, Professor, it's bias." At that, Carter's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered and leaned in further. Tell me then, he challenged, what does it say about someone's intellectual capacity when they still believe in an invisible sky daddy in 2025? When their cognitive development is so stunted that they need a fairy tale to explain the world. His voice dripped with sarcasm as he shot a pointed look at Barron. Perhaps some of our more politically connected students might enlighten us. The tension in the room became palpable. Students held their breath, eyes darting between Carter and Barron. This was no longer just an academic lecture. It was a public challenge. Barron's composure never wavered. Let's start with this, he said, his voice clear and unwavering. I find it curious that someone who values intellectual pursuit would claim that belief in God is a sign of lower intelligence. Many of the greatest scientific minds, Newton, Max Planck, Francis Collins, have acknowledged the role of a higher power in the universe. Even Einstein once remarked that science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. A hushed silence fell over the hall as Carter's confident expression wavered. Sensing an opening, Barron continued. And as for your graph, displaying an inverse correlation between IQ and religious belief, correlation does not equal causation. That is a fundamental statistical error that someone of your academic standing should know better than to make. A murmur of appreciation swept through the audience, and some students who had snickered moments earlier now leaned forward, listening intently. Carter clenched his jaw but attempted to retort. You can't use that as a blanket defense, Barron. Unperturbed, Barron pressed on. Furthermore, let's discuss faith itself. Faith isn't the enemy of intelligence. It takes faith to believe in human rights, in justice, and in love. Concepts that, while not scientifically quantifiable, shape our world profoundly. The real question is not whether faith and intelligence can coexist, but whether you, in your unwavering intellectual pride, can admit that there may be things beyond your understanding. The atmosphere grew electric with anticipation. Carter's face reddened as he attempted to regain control. Young man, you mock faith while clinging to your own form of dogma, a blind faith in your personal intellect. He snapped, but Barron, with quiet dignity, countered, I'm not mocking, I'm questioning. Your dismissal of faith is not based on reason or evidence. It's based on prejudice, and prejudice, as you often teach, is the enemy of true intellectual discourse. A few moments of stunned silence followed. The audience, initially divided between skepticism and amusement, now watched with rapt attention. Professor Wallace shifted in his seat, his concern deepening as Carter's once commanding presence began to crumble. Barron took a measured step closer to the podium, his eyes never leaving Carter's. Let me ask you this, Professor Carter. If belief in God is such a sign of intellectual weakness, why are you so threatened by it? The question hung in the air. For the first time, Carter opened his mouth as if to answer, but no words came. The room fell utterly silent, every eye fixed on the confrontation. After a long, agonizing pause, Barron continued. You argue that faith is a crutch for the intellectually weak, yet you yourself are unable to counter even basic theological arguments. Which do you think shows more intellectual insecurity, believing in a higher power or resorting to mockery as a substitute for genuine debate? His voice was firm, each word deliberate. I contend that faith and intellect are not enemies. Rather, they could be powerful allies in our pursuit of truth. A murmur ran through the audience. Some students nodded in agreement. Others exchanged glances that mixed awe with newfound respect. Professor Carter, visibly shaken, struggled to muster a response. Finally, his voice emerged weak and halting. I don't. He trailed off, unable to complete his rebuttal. At that moment, the lecture hall seemed to hold its collective breath. Professor Wallace cleared his throat and, rising from his seat, urged, let us return to the scheduled program, as we have much material to cover today. His interjection was gentle but firm, a lifeline to salvage the proceedings. Barron, recognizing the mercy offered, nodded graciously. Thank you, Professor Wallace, he said quietly. Turning to Carter, he added, I appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective. I believe that our debate today is not just about who is right, but about recognizing that true intellectual inquiry requires us to embrace complexity and sometimes to accept that faith plays a role in understanding our world. In the days that followed, the debate became legendary. Videos of the exchange circulated widely, sparking conversations across university campuses, social media platforms, and in academic journals. Students who had once dismissed Barron Trump as a beneficiary of his family's name now saw him as a formidable intellect, one who had dismantled arrogance with logic and grace. Professor Carter's reputation, once unassailable, was left in tatters. Many in the academic community began to question his approach and his dismissive treatment of faith. The incident ignited a broader discussion about the false dichotomy between faith and intellect, a conversation that would reverberate far beyond the confines of that prestigious conference hall. Barron Trump's performance was more than just a personal victory. It was a call to re-examine the values that underpin our understanding of truth and knowledge. His measured, respectful challenge to entrenched biases reminded everyone present that intellectual discourse should be about inquiry and openness rather than derision. And while the debate did not settle the issues at hand, it planted a seed of change, a belief that embracing both faith and reason might lead us closer to a more nuanced, comprehensive understanding of the world. As the conference continued, whispers of the debate spread like wildfire. Students, professors, and intellectuals from across the nation began to engage in discussions about the role of faith in scientific inquiry and the importance of humility in the pursuit of knowledge. Barron's measured demeanor and thoughtful arguments became a symbol of a new way of thinking, one that refused to be confined by outdated binaries and insisted on a synthesis of belief and reason. In the end, what transpired that day was more than an academic dispute. It was a transformative moment that challenged the very foundations of intellectual elitism. And while Professor Carter eventually resumed his lectures, the sting of that encounter lingered, reminding him and everyone else that true wisdom lies not in dismissing others' beliefs, but in acknowledging the limitations of our own understanding.